When it comes to the NBA's GOAT conversation, there's enough disagreement to fill an entire Thanksgiving dinner with your extended family. Now, when you break down the acronym, only one person can truly be the greatest of all time. Every year, The Athletic releases an anonymous poll of NBA players voting on who they think is currently the most overrated player in the league. After the 23-24 season, Rudy Gobert led the way with almost 14% of the 81 players polled. And then rounding out the rest of the top 5 were Jordan Poole, Trae Young, Dillon Brooks, and James Harden. This is only a basis for what we're getting into because after looking at those players, let's look throughout NBA history and build the most overrated player of all time. You're going to want to stick around because this gets a little bit tricky and some of you will be triggered. The first attribute we're going to give out is the most overrated shooter of all time. And it really comes down to what you value. Do you value totals or percentages, or do you value clutch shooting or consistency? There's a bunch of different factors. Over the past few decades, shooting, and in particular three-point shooting, has been the starting ground for the GOAT conversation. So let's get right into it. Steph is neither overrated or underrated. He is the shooting GOAT. And the greatest shooter of all time sits on his rightful throne and all-time leader in three-pointers made. Behind him are Harden, Ray Allen, Dame Lillard, and Reggie Miller. So at the end of the day, is this talent or opportunity? Is James Harden really a better three-point shooter than Ray Allen? No, that's not true at all. Jesus Shuttlesworth is a gift from God. So that makes Harden overrated, right? Well, also no, because no one is arguing for Harden to be the greatest three-point shooter ever. Steph's coach Steve Kerr holds the all-time three-point percentage lead, so is he a better shooter than Curry? No, but he's also not overrated. Overrated comes into play when the stats and eye tests are so far off they might as well be a Charles Barkley 3. And for context, Barkley currently has the lowest three-point percentage of all time based on players. So who might fit into this category? Maybe Dwayne Wade, but honestly he was never considered to be a shooter, more of a slasher. And this answer might get a little bit crazy, but we're gonna go with Russell Westbrook. During his MVP season, it felt like half the highlights were him burying a game-winning 3 at the buzzer from like 30 feet. And he shoots a lot of three-point attempts, ranking 240th in career attempts. But his career 30.4 average makes him the worst high-volume three-point shooter in the history of the league. Russ does a lot of things we've never seen on the basketball court before, and a lot of them are good, but honestly, he is the most overrated shooter ever. And I'm not saying fans consider him to be a great shooter, but he himself thinks he is. And at the end of the day, he isn't. Now we could move on to the most overrated defender. I know we've talked about him a lot, but do you know who isn't the most overrated defender of all time? The answer is again James Harden. He might actually be the most underrated defensive player of all time because all he does is deflect every single ball. So the guy we're definitely going to look at is Rudy Gobert. Even though he has 4 Defensive Player of the Years, there are times where he's benched in the playoffs. And it wasn't just because he wasn't good at offense, it was because he was getting cooked out on the perimeter. On the defensive side of the ball, overrated usually gravitates towards big men. A traditional center's height used to automatically qualify him as a good defender, and that's not how it works. But if you're a defender like Rudy Gobert, you just try to block everything while there's cutters coming through the lane. So that's why I think he's overrated as a defender as a whole. Another guy that a lot of people say is an overrated defender is LeBron James. He's great and his chase downs are awesome, but you know sometimes he takes plays off. But when it's time for him to lock in, he definitely does, at least in the past, so he's not our most overrated defender. Which brings us back to the man himself, Rudy Gobert. And look, I'm not here to try to make anyone's grandpa mad, so I'll let Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain have their glory, Wilt especially. I mean, you gotta look at that dude move. Serge Ibaka got a lot of love during the heyday of the KD, Westbrook, Harden, OKC teams and really fell off in Toronto. But even though he had a lot of Rudy in him when it came to being out of position, I don't know if he ranks high enough to be the most overrated defender ever. Look, there are a lot of bad and good defenders over the years, but this one goes to Rudy Gobert. I get it, he has 4 depoys, so how could he be overrated, but that's my entire point. If you have 4 depoys, then you should be known as one of the greatest defenders of all time. And it seems like everybody in the NBA disrespects him, so I don't think that's him. So now our player has Rudy Gobert's defense and Russell Westbrook's shooting. Now it's time to pick out another important part of basketball, and that's the most overrated playmaker. And I'll just get it out of the way up top, the answer isn't going to be Michael Jordan, but it's the closest he's going to come in any one of these categories. A lot of people like to say that Michael Jordan didn't pass the ball, but he actually created a lot of opportunities for his teammates. So I definitely don't want to pick him for most overrated. Kobe is another one of those players that people say doesn't pass the ball and cannot playmake. But his IQ is just way too high and he made some crazy passes throughout his day. So he's not going to be our most overrated playmaker ever. And then really quick, I want to glaze LeBron because he is one of the greatest playmakers ever and he's 6'9", which is right up there with Magic, which is just insane. But for this specific category, I think we're going to bring it down to 3 contenders. For the first contender, we're going to be talking about Isaiah Thomas, and no, not the one from the Celtics. We're going to be talking about the one from the Pistons because he only averaged 6.9 assists for his career. For someone who's often considered as the greatest point guard of all time, he didn't grab the stats to back it up. But when you take a look at those championship Pistons teams of the 80s and 90s, you can see that even if he wasn't getting an assist, he was making the play. He was the majority of the offense, so they would double and triple him so that he had to pass out, and he also got other guys open. The second contender we're talking about is John Stockton, which is kind of wild because he leads in all-time assists. And honestly, I may just be hating, but he was boring to watch. The only plays he really made were the same play, a pick and roll to Karl Malone. But the fact that he holds the record probably edges him out of being the most overrated ever. But don't get me wrong, he is a little bit overrated. But the third contender and our answer is gonna be Russell Westbrook again. Russ will go down as one of the best players of all time, and he was already voted part of the 75 team. He has an MVP and he just recorded his 200th triple-double. But when you go back and look at a lot of the games in his prime, Russ really wasn't creating a lot of plays for his teammates. And not creating a lot of plays for your teammates doesn't result in wins, which is something OKC didn't excel at, even though he was getting a triple-double every night. No one had the ball in his hands for more percentages of games than Westbrook. And the only person in recent league history that I could think of is Trae Young. When you hold the ball for that much time and garner that much attention, players will be open. And while he found some of those players, at least 5 of them a game for the most part, you're gonna end up tallying high numbers because the worst NBA player shooting an open shot is better than the best non-NBA player shooting an open shot. Out of the top 5 players in turnovers, Russ has played the fewest games and has the third fewest assists to balance it out. So we're gonna go with Russell Westbrook as the most overrated playmaker in the history of basketball. Now we're gonna move on to something that's arguably more important than everything we just said, and that's intangibles. A lot of what makes the GOAT conversation both so compelling and frustrating are the intangibles on both players. And these are the things you can't put a quantitative number on. What was the era like when they played? How were the styles different? The talent, the rules, everything's just so up in the air. For a majority of hoop heads, the cutoff is around 1980 to 81, or the Magic Bird era. This leaves Kareem, Russell, Wilt, Oscar, etc. on the outside looking in. Then you get into stuff like Jordan's era was more physical, but LeBron's had more talent and more evolved athletes. Bird's era almost vilified the three-point shot, while Curry's has been defined by it. Iverson leapt off the court whenever you saw him because his style was so different than everyone else's at the time. Kind of the same thing when Pistol Pete played. And then of course Kobe fans will argue with you until they're blue in the face that no one played harder than him. And then of course there's still KD loyalists that will say no one was better than him at any point in time. When it gets into substance versus style, you have to think about the intangibles that actually led to winning. As cool that it is that he hung around the league for so long and had such a cultural impact when he came in, I think this might just go to Vince Carter. A McDonald's All-American and North Carolina Tar Heel legend, there were definitely whispers of the next Jordan when it came to Vince, and he might just be the best dunker of all time. But he literally didn't win anything other than a dunk contest and a Rookie of the Year award. Think about it. What's your favorite Vince Carter memory that isn't a dunk? Vince Carter is the most overrated player of all time when it comes to legacy versus results. And so he's our pick for intangibles for the most overrated player ever that we're building. The fun thing about stuff like this is there isn't really one true answer. There's always going to be someone at a Thanksgiving dinner out there that thinks Michael Jordan is the most overrated player of all time. And then there's also going to be someone at the same Thanksgiving table out there that thinks LeBron James is the most overrated player of all time. Then there's someone at a Thanksgiving dinner out there that thinks Victor Wembanyama is the most overrated player of all time. To this person, I would suggest laying off the eggnog, or at least wait until Christmas time. But if I'm building the most overrated player of all time out of existing players, I think the attributes that we just selected are very valid. Leave a comment down below if you agree or if you have another nomination for the most overrated player of all time. And as always, click on the screen for more basketball content.